Today, I'm excited to welcome Amber Sparks with her new book, Happy People Don't Live Here. Amber Sparks is the author of the short story collections And I Do Not Forgive You and The Unfinished World. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review, Granta, Slate, and elsewhere. In her new book, Happy People Don't Live Here, Sparks weaves a darkly funny gothic tale about a reclusive mother and her daughter who move into a haunted building brimming with eccentrics and secrets. It is an unforgivable portrait of a family, whether by birth, chance, or choice, and the sometimes dangerous myths we make to keep ours together. Sparks will be in conversation with Shannon Sanders, the author of the linked short story collection Company, which won the 2024 Los Angeles Times Book Prize Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. Her short fiction has appeared in One Story, Siwana Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Electric Literature, and elsewhere. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Amber Sparks and Shannon Sanders.
Hello, can you hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. I am really excited about this. This book is such a treat. And it is a perfect, I think, kickoff to spooky week, I guess, or a really good treat for the middle of spooky season. And Amber has said that she's going to read for us, and I'm excited about that too. So Amber, let me know if you're ready.
Great. I am just going to look for this page that I need to read because I am totally prepared. There we go. All right. This is like the kind of chair that I never know if I should sit or stand because it's like halfway between. Hello. Nice to see so many people I know. I'll do this. How about that? I'll just perch. All right, so I don't want to give like a whole long spiel about this book because you haven't read it yet, and that would be really boring for you. So I'll just tell you a couple of quick things that you need to know, which is that the two main characters in the book are Fern and Alice. Fern is 10, Alice is in her 30s. Fern is Alice's daughter, and they have moved into an apartment building that used to be a sanatorium, tuberculosis sanatorium in the 1920s. And both of them have a lot of secrets, and that's pretty much all you need to know for context. So this chapter is called In Which There Are Nighttime Secrets and Secret Animal Lives. That night, after her mother was asleep, Fern got out of bed and went to the kitchen. She grabbed a stack of snickerdoodles and her mother's computer, and she looked Noel, the professor, up online. And Noel is her mother's new love interest, so she's investigating him. Might he be able to help her with her dead body? Oh, sorry, that is an important point. I should mention Fern has found a dead body. That's kind of important to know. It's not a spoiler because it literally happens in the first few pages of the book. Might he be able to help her with her dead body? Professors know how to find things out. He could be very brilliant. He could also be a suspect, she thought, a brilliant killer. She ate and considered, ate and took notes. She didn't see anything about medieval studies, though he did appear to teach at 3 different colleges. 3, thought Fern. That seemed impressive. She found a few articles that he'd authored in academic journals, but they were behind paywalls, and they looked boring anyway. Wives, she typed. He had indeed been married twice, but both wives were disappointingly alive and ordinary. One was selling leggings online, and the other appeared to be a real estate agent. The leggings one had a baby. In the pictures, the baby looked noisy and moist, and Fern could not understand why anyone would want a baby. She understood, of course, that babies do turn into more interesting people, but it hardly seemed worth the wait. Ah, Fern thought, cramming the last bite of cookie into her mouth. Here we have something. She clicked with great optimism on a link about a body being found, but it turned out that the professor had simply written a piece on Richard III's body being found underneath some parking lot somewhere. A parking lot. Imagine that. Fern found it fascinating how mundane everything disastrous inevitably became. The opposite of entropy. Her own home, a case in point. Once this had been a place of suffering, hope, sadness, and sickness, chaotic and uncertain. Now there were laundry machines in the operating room and red Dixie cups in the graveyard. Fern? Alice appeared around the hallway corner in her pajama top. What are you doing out here? Just answering some emails for you, Fern lied. Alice would never check. Mom, asked Fern, what was my dad like? Alice considered the question in a way that she wouldn't have during the daylight hours. She frowned at the ceiling, the sink, the stovetop. He was a painting, she said, but a very expensive one. It felt like I would be paying for him forever. That is not the description of a person, said Fern, shutting the computer. Most people don't fit the description of a person, said Alice. She walked her daughter to the bedroom and watched her carefully slide herself under the covers without disturbing the piles of library books scattered across the comforter. She kissed Fern on the cheek and turned out the lights. Alice went to the kitchen and made chamomile tea. She drank it hot, let it numb her tongue. She let her gaze fall lazily out the window and saw the woman in apartment 4 across the way. The one Fern called the Cursed Lady. Alice sipped her tea and watched, but the lady wasn't doing much of anything. Was this voyeuristic? The places they had lived before were more private, and Alice felt embarrassed to be so openly spying on her neighbor, but she didn't move or look away. She was transfixed by this image of this woman, so strangely old-fashioned. Her hair was carefully curled, and she had an old way of holding herself, a lounge posture, hand on hip. She wore a green dress with a flared skirt, a deep jeweled green, and her hair was very black. She seemed thin and fragile, like there was a hollowness to her. She wasn't young, but she wasn't old either. It was hard to tell in the low light and from this far away, but maybe mid-40s? The shadows under her collarbones were visible clear across the courtyard. Whatever Fern had seen in the dumpster, it wasn't the body of this woman. As Alice watched, the lights went out, and the woman's image was lost in darkness. No one, except the building superintendent, Mrs. Teasdale, had ever met the lady from the other apartment. No one had seen her set foot outside of her apartment, and Alice wondered if maybe she was agoraphobic, or maybe she worked at night. Mrs. Teasdale said she was quiet, and she kept to herself. She had lived alone, said Mrs. Teasdale, since she moved in a few years ago. Alice tried to remember if Mrs. Teasdale had given her a name, but she didn't think so. Fern, of course, had her own wild theories. She's cursed in some way, said Fern. Maybe she's a shapeshifter. Maybe she has a whole secret animal life. Alice liked the idea of a secret life, a secret animal life, which was stupid because half of her life had been a secret life. But somehow the animal part of it sounded romantic, something enchanted, not a woman hiding in her car at the Safeway, hoping her anxiety will shield her. But instead a woman hiding in her fox fur in an earthen den, inscrutable and feral. But of course, secret animal lives always sound better in stories, and in real life, secret animal lives are full of mess and smell and disease and babies and pain and fighting and fear, and then after a very short time, you die and turn into a secret animal skeleton. The next morning, Alice and Fern walked through the U with their arms full of packages, heading off to the post office. They spotted the Mermaid Lady smoking at the picnic table. "Excuse me," said Fern. "Have you seen any dead bodies around here recently?" Alice groaned, but the Mermaid Lady seemed unfazed, as though people had asked her that question every day. "No, honey," she said, "I haven't seen any dead bodies. Not lately." "And has anyone disappeared recently, to your knowledge?" asked Fern. "Fern," said Alice, "please leave our neighbor alone." "No, it's fine," said the Mermaid Lady. "I like this kid." Alice shifted the weight of her packages awkwardly. "Let's go, Fern," she said. "I've known people who disappeared before," the Mermaid Lady called out after them. "Lots of them. I mean, I'm one of them, I guess." She gestured vaguely with a hand capped with long fuchsia nails and dozens of coral and turquoise bangles. Alice stood in the parking lot next to her car, watching the Mermaid Lady stub out her cigarette on the white plastic. She noticed that from here, on this hill, you couldn't see anything but sky and scrub grass and concrete, gray on gray on gray. She thought about how disappointed most people would be if they found out what really happened to some of the girls who disappear. Not dead in a gutter or gone as a swan, but putting packages in a car in the most anonymous way in the world. Thank you. All right. Now this is the good part where we get to talk.
Incredible. Thank you so much for reading that. And you did start to give us a little bit of an orientation to the book, but for those who have not gotten a chance to read it yet, can you just start by telling us a little bit about it? What is Happy People Don't Live Here?
Absolutely. It is, first and foremost, I think it's a story about a mother and daughter. And, everything else is sort of, I don't want to say extra, but but it's, icing. But it's the story of a mother and daughter a mother who has moved around a lot in her life and has a lot of secrets and kind of has dragged this daughter around with her. And hasn't really given her very much information. So her daughter's grown up very, very independent, and in some ways actually takes care of her mother a little bit. And so they move into this new place that used to be a sanatorium, and it's kind of this crappy, crumbling apartment building now. There are ghosts that live in the apartment building, and there are really odd people that live in the apartment building. And so they, start to meet some of them, and there are lots of different mysteries that unfold. And as I mentioned, Fern finds a dead body, and that's another mystery. So yeah, it is. There are a lot of unhappy people in it, but it's I promise it's not like too depressing.
No, definitely not. It's not an unhappy experience to be reading it and living there with them. I am always curious with novels, especially because this book is so many things. It is a mystery. It's a ghost story. Like you said, it's a mother-daughter story. It's in many ways, it's a social novel because it takes place within sort of a contained social structure. There's an ensemble cast. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us, what was the germ of the story? What's the first thing that came into your head that you said, I want to build a novel around that? An image or a character or anything?
Yeah. I think there were two sort of separate threads. One of them was Fern and Alice, who were just characters that I'd been playing with for a long time. I had them in my head, and I saw them very clearly. And Alice in particular, I had sort of this idea about like somebody who used to be famous and wasn't anymore. Not a huge secret, don't worry. And so I knew I wanted to do something with them, but I couldn't find the right like story for them. And then at the same time, I had this. I was kind of going down the rabbit hole of research. I do this for my books. I get way too into the research part. That's like my favorite part. I don't actually want to write the book. I just want to research it. And I'd gotten
the opposite of what almost every writer wants to do, by the way. Yeah.
This is true. And I'd gotten really into researching, kind of off topic, tuberculosis sanitariums. I love that my daughter's history teacher is here. I did not plan this. I will talk about how history was so important. No, but I got really into, like, I started reading about all these sanitariums and learning all these things that I didn't know. I'd already sort of thought of them as this very, like, creepy place where, like interchangeably with almost like mental institutions, which often also get called sanatoriums. And what I discovered is that they were actually these really kind of remarkable places in a lot of cases, where the like really sort of latest in medical technology was actually being like deployed, and a lot of people survived and thrived after their experiences there. And you know, in a lot of cases, they were actually places where people who were like lower class and middle class could actually get treatment even if they couldn't pay for it, because the state was so invested in like actually having people not all be dying of tuberculosis, because then they'd have no workers. So I, you know, I knew I wanted to do something with that. And then I had always wanted to do a haunted house novel. That was like always something that I love. Haunted house novels are one of my favorite genres. And during the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic, I started sort of thinking, okay, what can I write to, you know, to entertain myself? And I was stuck in this apartment building myself pretty much all the time. And I started thinking again about the idea of, okay, what if it's a haunted apartment? And then all the threads sort of came together, and I was like, I'm going to write about all these things. So, yeah.
That is so cool. I'm going to follow up about Fern in particular, because that character, I know that you're a big reader, of course, and I saw so many influences kind of converging in her. I started to just sort of keep track. Turtle Wexler from the Westing game. I saw some Nancy Drew in there, some Harriet the Spy, Rosamund from Nate the Great. I don't know if that was like an intentional one, but a little bit of Wednesday Addams. Yeah. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about both how you created that character and sort of who you had in mind or what you had in mind. And then the same question about Alice, because she was a little bit more of a mystery to me, and she was a little bit more of a character I had to get to know.
Yeah, I think that's right. Fern, I always knew I wanted to write because, I have always loved that character, right? The Turtle Wexler, you know, we have always lived in the castle, Maricat, all of the, there's something about the like plucky, you know, young girl character, who's the only one who knows what is going on. And like, you know, everyone else is just sort of this bumbling adult. And I've always loved that idea, and I really wanted to play with that. But at the same time, I didn't want to write that book, right? That's the book that you write for someone who's actually like 10 or 12, and, you know, you want them to really feel like they're smarter than all the adults. But I kind of wanted to have this character and have at the same time, you know, she's not smarter than all the adults, right? She thinks she is, and in some ways she is, but she doesn't know everything, and so I kind of wanted to write that character, but more from an adult perspective, if that makes sense. But I do love writing. You know, I feel like writers either remember their childhood or they don't, right? Like you either like have a really good sense, of like, and I remember everything, right? Every single thing that happened to me in my childhood, like vividly, which used to drive my mother nuts, because she would like, she'd be like, well, that's not what happened, and I'm like, you don't know. I remember what we had for breakfast that morning. And so to me, it's still, I've always been very concerned with the idea that like, and you know, you have kids, like that kids are people. They're just people. They're young little people, but they're just people, just like us. And I remember what it was like to feel like I'm a person, and why isn't anyone listening to me, or why doesn't anyone take me seriously? So I think that's just fun to write from all kinds of angles. And Alice was someone I really liked, because I like that you say that you have to get to know her, because she's somebody who has lots of layers. She has had so much kind of crappy stuff happen to her that she's built up like protections around herself. You know, those have to sort of come down throughout the course of the book, and she's very adept at putting up new ones really quickly as a mechanism, coping mechanism. But I liked the idea of having a mother and doing it from the mother's perspective as well as the daughter. I'm a mom. I have a daughter, and at the time that I wrote the book or started writing the book, my mom had actually just passed away, and so I was thinking a lot about mothers and daughters and relationships between the two, and I kind of always knew that I wanted them to be my anchor points.
Yeah, and following up on that a little bit, so they have a very dynamic relationship, Alice and Fern, and one where we can see that their relationship began off the page much earlier than we come into the story. They have sort of a repartee, they have routines, they have a way that they dialogue with each other that's really interesting. Was that a lot of fun to write?
It was. It was hard in a lot of ways. Like, I really overwrote, like this book was a lot longer and had a lot more in it and was a lot more stuffed before, before editors got their hands on it and before I edited it. But it was the first time that it was really funny, actually, because after I finished, so my first reader was Chris, my husband, and after he read it, he was like, "Oh, the dialogue's actually good in this," which was actually, very funny not because he doesn't think I'm a good writer, but because I don't typically write dialogue, and it's like always been kind of like I've perceived it as a weakness that I'm not good at that, and it's mostly because I just didn't do it. I was so scared of it. And for this book, I really had to write dialogue. Like, you could not get around that. And so I actually had a lot of fun writing it. It's what I found out. I was like, oh, like if you have the character's voice and you actually know it and have kind of lived in it long enough and marinated in it, it's actually really fun to have imaginary conversations in your head all the time.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun because one character is 10 and of course the other is an adult, and she's sort of tempering the things that she's going to say. But there's something really interesting that happens between the actual, because this book is in sort of a roaming third person. We get to, not necessarily omnisciently, but we get to visit with a lot of characters. And Fern has these deep convictions, and the other characters in the book are at varying levels of taking her seriously, which is really interesting because we start to get sort of the narrator's point of view on what is real and what isn't. How did you approach that? I found that really interesting, the way that Fern will be so convinced of something. And so one example is that she has seen a dead body, for example, which her mother immediately dismisses. But other characters sort of take her at face value, Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit, of the tension between what's real in the imagination of a child character versus the narrator's point of view on it?
Yeah. I think, in some sense, it's interesting because it actually shifts a little bit throughout the book, intentionally so, where, you actually start off like the second chapter of the book where you really sort of meet Fern and everybody that lives in the apartment building. You actually or kind of see it through Fern's eyes for the first time, and she's walking through, right? And she's kind of given everybody these fairy tale names and backstories. They all have archetypes. She doesn't really see them as people. And that sort of evolves through the course of the book, where she, starts to sort of like realize, okay, these are real people, and and gives them real names. So I some of that I think is sort of built in that way, where if the perspective is like closer to Fern's, it's a little bit more of a almost that fantasy perspective. But I also think the other characters do take Fern seriously in a way that to your point, her mother doesn't always. And in some ways, I think that was intentional, because these other characters themselves are all kind of misfits in their own way. They all kind of they all have reasons for living in this weird, creepy place, kind of far away from everybody else, and they all sort of have their own secrets and stuff. But I feel like in some ways they're just like they look at her as more of an adult or more of a like just another person than her mother does, who's kind of like, okay, you're still a child to me, which I think is probably pretty typical for parents. There's probably other adults that would take your child more seriously than you do, because you're like, oh yeah, that's right, they have grown.
I think this is not a spoiler either, because you've mentioned it as well. The book is filled with ghosts. And there are so many different ways to write ghosts or to sort of depict them. They can be a suggestion that kind of fills in, or they can just sort of be explicitly, there's ghosts, deal with it. And this book sort of does the latter. Talk about that, about how what it was like to write the ghosts, how you approached it, and how you decided on that, and if anything changed throughout the edits to the book.
Yeah, the ghosts were tricky, and I actually that day did change a lot throughout the editing process, because I did kind of, as soon as I knew I was going to write about a sanatorium, I was like, okay, well, I want to have ghosts, because this has been an unhappy place, and a lot of people have died here, and it's got to have ghosts. And also, I kind of wanted to give Fern the ability to see the ghosts as well. And also because I just firmly believe that if you're like, what does my book need? It needs something more. It needs a ghost. That's fine. It'll make it all better. But at the beginning of the book, the ghosts were much more to your point, kind of like for almost furniture. Like they were just kind of there, and they weren't really doing anything. They were very much scenery. And my editor was like, they're cool, but can they do something? Yeah. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess I should do something with them. So then we started sort of developing the idea of like the ghosts having sort of different sort of manifestations and personalities, and gave them their own chapter at one point, and then of course eventually, well, I won't spoil that, but the ghosts become more real at some point.
Yeah. Something else that as I read, imagined that you must have had a lot of fun with was devising the rest of the cast of characters. And like you said, this is an apartment complex that has a very rich history, just place-wise. And then the characters there are all misfits, and there is a sense that they have all made their way there because things haven't gone well for them, or because they don't belong in other places. And they have such interesting names. They have such interesting ways that they appear to Fern. I keep wanting to call her Turtle, but Fern.
Either way.
To Fern, who she gives them little nicknames or epithets for herself. Yeah. Can you tell us about devising those other characters and how you decided on how many and what they should be like, what they should bring to the cast?
Yeah, that was hard because the book actually had like 20 people living in the apartment building at first, and even more, I think. And like I turned in the book to my agent because he's always like my first editor, and he was like, okay, there's a lot of characters in this book, and we're not writing War and Peace here. And I was like, well, I could. And he was like, no, let's not do that. So I knew I had to take out a lot of people. And a lot of them were like extraneous. Like I'd never, because I'm a short story writer, right? So I'd never written a book that had so many characters. That's just like a luxury you don't get when you're writing short stories, right? You get a few and that's it. And so I think I got a little too excited about it. And I was like, I can have endless characters. And then, it was like, well, they weren't. So then I had to actually go through and figure out like who's actually important and who's doing something, and not just there to sort of exist because, they need to occupy an apartment or whatever. And, basically ended up just keeping kind of the most interesting characters, the ones that were interesting to me personally. So I know, in some ways that it probably feels like it's like really quirky because like the ones that I kept were like probably the weirdest ones, but that's because I was like, these people are going to be fun to like write and develop, and also have sort of voices and existences that are like the most unlike each other. I felt like they were all pretty unique. So
Yeah. And so in the end, it gets boiled down to something like, I would say 7 neighbor characters, something like that.
Yeah,
So it's
I
not
think
20,
so.
but they're all very vivid, and some of them come with their own very vivid apartment settings.
Yes.
And this book has a motif, doll houses and miniatures. And so, for example, Fern has a fairy house she's carrying around at the beginning. Alice is a miniaturist.
Yeah.
And so the world of the apartments almost kind of echoes that. It feels a little bit like a dollhouse.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested. I'm going to come back to the short stories versus novel form writing question.
Excellent.
But what was it like to write at this scale and to have this enclosed space and sort of this really finite palette?
Yeah. It was. So I've always actually just been really interested in miniatures, dollhouses, all of that kind of stuff. I don't know why. I have no idea, but I've just always been fascinated with it. I have a dollhouse that, I got when I was little, and my dad passed it down from like his granddad, and so I've just always been real interested in small things in general, miniatures of all kinds, so I kind of, this is a weird digression, but it's not a digression. It's very important to me that all my characters have jobs.
Yeah.
In my books. I hate when like you read a book and it's like someone's just floating around kind of existing and you're like, well, how the hell are they making any money? Or like, that's stupid. Yeah. So it's very important to me that characters have jobs. And in this case, I was like, okay, well, what job can Alice have where she can still be this like recluse and, not leave her apartment? And I was like, well, she can make things and sell them on Etsy because, that's a good job for her. And I like, that was actually just a really fun rabbit hole to go down because, there are so many people making tiny things and selling them on Etsy that I was able to do a lot of research on that. And, that I had a good time doing it. So, but it was not as hard as it sounds to write at that scale because, again, because of the pandemic and because of just feeling so confined at that time period, it did feel like everything was smaller. Like everything was like this sort of, tableau or diorama or something that people were sort of trapped in. So, that it almost felt weirdly appropriate to write.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It feels like walking through a dollhouse a little bit. At one point, the characters are like, "We've got to get everybody together. Where should we go? The laundry room." And so there is that feeling of the whole palette being really, really. It's just really right there. Yeah. So I want to go, and I will probably, if we have time, I'll come back and ask a couple more questions about the other characters and the setting and all of that. But we are both short story writers who are now publishing novels. And I want you to tell me everything about how you found that experience to be, because of course Amber has multiple short story collections and is a beloved short story writer. So tell me about writing a novel. What did you find challenging? What did you find surprising or less challenging than you thought about moving from short stories to the longer form?
I love that we're having this conversation now because the last time I talked to Shannon about her book in a setting like this, I was just finishing up my novel and she had just, written her collection and is now and has finished your novel, right? And it's all set to be published. I think.
It'll be out next July.
Next July. Shannon's fantastic, so look for it. It is funny, but I really hated it. Did you hate it? I really hated writing a novel. I was
Say more.
Right? I was like, what am I doing? This is so horrible, every second of it. I'm also just really stubborn, so I was like, well, I'm going to do this because I said I would, and it's going to happen. And also because at that point I was invested in the story, but I had to literally write a short story collection around the novel, like as I was writing the novel, because otherwise I just would have like expired of like boredom, right? Not boredom, but like, having to sort of, because working on a novel is really hard, right? I'm not that short stories aren't hard, but there are problems that you have to solve in a novel, and like there's like a whole chapter that you just don't want to write. That's like the worst thing ever to write, and you're like, I don't want to write that chapter, and like that doesn't happen in a story. I mean, you might have a few pages you don't want to write, but it's not like a whole chapter or a whole section of the book.
And of course, like you cannot tell that there's a chapter that she didn't enjoy writing in this book, and that is the challenging part. Is
That
making
is
sure
really
that the reader
challenging.
doesn't have that experience with it. Yeah.
I don't know. What did you like? How did you find it? Did you like it?
You know, I actually did. I really liked writing a novel, but I found a lot of things about it to be challenging in different ways. And I do not subscribe to the idea that one is harder or easier than the other one. I think that they're too different, but the feedback loop isn't there.
Yeah.
So with short stories, you can send them out, you can share them with people, you can get some, sort of a dialogue going.
Yes.
But here you had to actually immerse in what is it? I'm sorry, Pine Lake, right?
Yeah.
The Pine Lake apartments. And you had to live there until you were finished with the whole book.
Yeah. And you feel like a crazy person because you're like, here's this thing I wrote. And like, you're like, I don't know if this is insane. Like, I don't know if this is like the weirdest thing and people are just going to read it and be like, okay, why did you just write this? But yeah, you're right. The feedback isn't there at all. So, and you work on it for so long. It took me like 5 years to write this book. And, and then at the end of that time, you're like, I hope this is a thing that can exist.
No, and it's wonderful. So it's worth it. But of course, to your point, like you will not know that until you get all the way to the other side of it.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk a little bit, because there's a sort of a timeless feeling to the book, and it almost feels like there are overlapping. The characters all seem to represent different times, and they seem to have, even though they're emailing and they're texting and things like that, and they're sometimes going to Target to get things, there's just a feeling of like a little bit of a suspension in time. And I wondered how you evoked that. I think it feels really like it was done by craft. So
I love that. Thank you. That's very intentional, I think. I knew I didn't want to, because like at first when I started writing the book, I like to tend to write things in a way that feels very storytelling, right? It feels like you're being told a story. And I guess in that timeless sort of way, like this story could happen anywhere, in any place, in any time. And in some ways, that's what I wanted to do here. And when I first kind of had started this book and had like kind of a really rough draft, I realized, nobody was texting. There was sort of a timeless, it kind of existed in no time. And no, there weren't no like video games or any of that kind of stuff. And then I was like, well, that's just a cop-out. That's just being lazy, right? Because writers will do that, right? They'll like, and I don't, no shade, because it's cool to set your book in the 90s too, but like people will totally set their book in the 90s just so they don't have to like deal with text messages or smartphones. Now I'm going to have to like set a book in the 90s just because I said that. But I knew I did want to deal with those things because in a weird way, I wanted to tell a story that felt like a fairy tale or a fable that could also have these modern elements to it, that could be told with internet and Etsy and, people doing online scams and things, but also at the same time could feel like it could happen anywhere at any time in any place, sort of.
Yeah, something else interesting that I noticed, and this gave it a little bit of an agelessness too. So there's a little bit of a romance that threads through the book, and I noticed that there's like a very sensitive approach to the characters being romantic with each other, or even being sexual with each other. And I wondered about your thoughts on approaching that. I know that there's always like a big dialogue about how much has to be represented on the page, and yeah.
It's, to me, it was just like not that interesting to write those scenes. Like I'll read them and and I like to, and like anybody. And I think there are some people who write that. I mean, like James Salter can, write a scene like nobody's business, right? And so there was no like sense of like, oh, I don't think this is appropriate or I don't want to write it or whatever. But there's something to like the classic movie where they close the door and the camera pans away and what's happening, but it's like a little wink and a nod. And in some ways I kind of liked that that approach. Also in a weird way, it felt like I didn't want to be too graphic in parts of it because the point of view is so often Fern's so often is kind of going back and forth that it felt almost like in a weird way like Fern was in the next room. And
I was wondering if you were going to say because Fern was watching. Yeah.
It was kind of a strange thing, but yeah.
That's so interesting. Okay, you reminded me of something else I want to ask, and then I have my final question, and I'm going to turn it to the audience. But there is so much old film that is also it's very present on the page here. And I know, I recognized that I didn't know all of it. I knew that I was being introduced to something that I wouldn't necessarily recognize myself, but that the author knew very well. Can you talk about some of the influences from other than outside of literature, so movies, TV, whatever it was?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's like no question. I'm influenced as much, if not more, by film when I'm writing a book. And because I'm just a huge film person, I love film, and sort of my other life, I write for film magazines and love thinking about TV and film. And particularly, classic films, as I'm sure you can tell. And that was there was sort of an interesting, I don't know, not really an Easter egg, but like my mom and I used to stay up late at night, and because we were both insomniacs, and watch Turner Classic Movies. I'd walk upstairs when I couldn't sleep, and she'd have some old movie playing. She'd have Shop Around the Corner or something playing, and I'd sit down and I'd start watching with her. And so there's a scene in there with Fern and her mom watching TV that I threw in there intentionally, and so there's definitely like sort of little Easter eggs in there just because I love film and I love thinking about it, and I always just like whatever's interesting to me tends to find its way into my books just because otherwise I would be bored writing them. But also I think just the way that I think about things, like scenes, setting up scenes and everything is oftentimes very cinematic in the way that my brain works. Cinematic and sort of staged also, because I do have, my background is actually in theater, and that's like what I went to school for. And so I do think a lot about like giving my characters business and like where are they on this, and blocking and things like that are always sort of in my head. But I think, a good example of, I can give you like a concrete example. So the that first part of the book I talked about that opens up and Fern's like walking through, it's just like one long walk basically where she's got her fairy house, like you said, and she's walking through the entire apartment complex, and we get her thoughts on everybody as she sees them in the morning. And I wrote that very intentionally because I joke, but it's not really a joke, that I'm always trying to write the opening scene of Boogie Nights because it's like the perfect scene. And it's so perfect in the way that it like sets up the narrative and introduces you to all the characters and gives you the tone for the rest of the film. And it just does all the things so efficiently in the first like 5 minutes. And so I was actually like talking to Matt Bell when I was, who's another author, about when I was stuck doing this scene, and I was like, I just kind of want to write it like the scene in Boogie Nights, and like there's somebody roller skating by, and he's like, well, just do it. And I was like, oh, okay, I will. And like, so you wouldn't know. I mean, it doesn't actually, nobody's roller skating around in a disco, bar, but like I feel like I tend to solve a lot of problems in books through film.
That's so interesting. I love that. I thought of The Shining, of Danny on his trike riding through the Overlook.
Yeah.
Even though he's not encountering and having commentary on the characters because he doesn't know them.
Yeah. Or at least not, except in his head.
But on that topic, okay, it doesn't have to be Alice and Fern, but it can be if you want. Can you dreamcast for the movie any two characters that you want from the novel with any two, doesn't have to be from this time period, but from any time actors?
Oh, anytime. So I actually, I cheated a little bit because I got this question in an interview, which is, so I have actually thought about this, but I didn't think about any time period. They were kind of like contemporary. So what I said then was Dev Patel and for the professor, and Christina Milioti for Alice. But I don't really know a lot of child actors, so I was kind of like, I don't know who I'd like. I guess you could go back in time and cast like Christina Ricci as a child. Would probably be the closest fit, or maybe Saoirse Ronan as a kid, but for Fern. But yeah.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, that's really fun. I have some ideas for you too, but I'll send them to you later.
Yes, please. Because they're going to make a movie out of this, right? So
they should. They absolutely should.
I have this so I do tend to I don't know if you do this, but I do cast my characters usually in my head a lot of times, and I cast my last novel, which ended up being a novella in the book, and I had Tom Hiddleston as like the main character, and I was so involved in this decision that every year I was just like, they haven't made my book into a movie, and I wasn't mad about it because they hadn't made it into a movie. I was mad because Tom Hiddleston was like aging out of it, and I was like, oh no, it's gonna be too late. So I do think about that a lot.
I can relate. I would love to open it up for anyone else's questions.
Yeah. Yes, Isadora.
Microphone for you. Or you can ask it.
Do you want a microphone? Okay. Go ahead. Oh. Is it something you want to ask me later? Okay, that's fine. That's my daughter, Isadora. Okay. Anybody? Yeah.
Is there any one sanatorium that you based it on, or did you make an amalgamation? And if it is, what did you learn a lot about? What was the most surprising thing?
Yeah, I did base it off of one in just outside of Duluth, Minnesota, which is actually why I ended up setting the book in Minnesota. We're actually from Minnesota, but I hadn't really thought about that. I was going to set it in upstate New York or someplace, and I ended up moving it there because I loved the sanatorium that I found so much. I think the most surprising thing to me was how many that there was 50 to 60% of people that actually recovered and walked away and were fine, and I had just always thought, TB was this thing that if you got it, it was a death sentence and you coughed and then you died, coughed blood into a handkerchief and then that was it for you. And I, learned there's all these different kinds of TB, and a lot of people did actually survive because of some of the treatments they did, even if they were crazy or seemed crazy, actually worked. When they would put people under these heat lamps and basically cook your bones, which the reason they were using it was kind of wrong, but they were actually right. And what it ended up doing, because it was this bacterial TB or whatever, that was a little bit different than the kind in your lungs. So those people actually had a better, actually got better and, survived. So, that was really, really interesting to me. And just the fact that it wasn't they weren't these places of misery necessarily. Obviously nobody wanted to be there. But that they were, all kinds of people would go there, and they would have Christmas parties, and they would have social gatherings, and they were sort of people in different stages of sickness, and people would go on dates. There was like dates arranged and things, so like there was this whole sort of other life there that wasn't just people like all laying in beds being like all day long. So although that was part of it, yeah.
That is interesting. Other questions?
Yes.
On the same topic, did your ghosts come from your research on sanitariums, or did they come just from writing and finding it through writing?
I think most of the ghosts were just sort of modeled on people from the 1920s, like sort of general types of people. One of the ghosts is like con artist, like sort of from the 1920s. So there are people I think there are ghosts who are sort of muttering about, most of the time they're not really developed enough necessarily to be like full people. But I think it was more about the like sort of 1910s, 1920s, 1930s like time period than like anything sort of specific to the sanitarium. Like there's nobody that sort of wanders around being like, I died of TB or anything like that. So, yeah, but it was fun also because I also, one of my obsessions, like just forever, is the 1920s and sort of the beginning of modernity. I've always just been obsessed with that. And so that was really fun to get to just dig into that for a story, which ostensibly, takes place in, the contemporary era. So, yeah.
Other questions?
Anybody else?
Did you have to research seances?
I sort of did a little bit, and I sort of also just made it up. Because there's a seance in the book. There's no spoiler, but it mostly just because I'd always wanted to write a seance. I thought that would be fun. But I also kind of felt like none of the characters actually knew how to do a seance anyway, so so I didn't feel like there had to be any like super fidelity. I've done some research on sort of that like spiritualist time period. I don't know like a ton about it, but I know. Do you know Adrian Van Young? He wrote a really good book about it. Sort of spiritualist photographs, and it's like a horror novel. It's really creepy. And I remember talking to him about all the research he did into that era, and it was fascinating. But in that case, I was kind of like, well, these people are just making this stuff up. They don't, like, there's one lady one person, one of the characters, who, the medium, who, like, is sort of, kind of knows what they're doing. But everybody else is just making it up. So, yeah.
That's the most fun.
Exactly. So, and then after I was done, because I feel guilty like 90% of the time because I'm from the Midwest. So I immediately was like, oh no, like I hope nobody, is like, a professional like medium or like seance doer that's gonna feel like I disrespected their craft in any way. But hopefully they would understand that, the characters are all just kind of bumbling idiots and they don't know what they're doing.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
What happened with the Shadow short story collection that you wrote
Oh.
Oh, yeah. That should be out next year, maybe, or very early the year after if I actually get off my butt and finish it, because I have like a couple stories still to write. But yeah, it's called Did People in the Middle Ages Love Their Children? And it's a collection mostly of stories about families and kids and relationships and families and things like that. So I think it'll be good. It was certainly, it feels like, I don't know if you had this experience, but like, it felt like such a relief to go back and start writing short stories again. Like just recently, I was like, oh, thank God. Oh, I was talking to Hannah Greco, and she was like, don't tell me, because she's like in the middle of like the novel, and she's like, don't tell me that it feels good to write the stories again. It doesn't, right? Like you just wish you were writing the novel, and I'm like, no, it feels so good. It's like a warm bath. Sorry.
I haven't been able to do that yet, so.
Oh, okay, yeah. Hang in there. I should say also that for the record that I am going to write another novel, because like it's just this sickness that you get and then you can't do anything about it. I was warned, and it did happen to me, because like now I'm like, ooh, but the world building I can do, right? So, yeah.
Totally. Gets under your skin.
Yes.
Any other questions? And if not, Amber, thank you so much. This book is such a joy. Please read it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being in conversation with you. So, and thank you all for coming on this
Sorry, I interrupted the applause.
night. You may clap. Thank you.